Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. The Canada-US relationship is defining. It's fundamental, it is often frustrating, but it is at its core how our future has unfolded. We are quite literally joined at the hip. So we have looked at this relationship from many different perspectives, today's politics, economics. But today we turn to Tim Cook. He is the country's leading military historian, director of research at the Canadian War Museum, the author of 19 books. I'll just say that, 1-9. And his latest is entitled The Good Allies, How Canada and the US Fought Together to Defeat Fascism During the Second World War. But it is actually the story of how two pretty wary rivals became friends and steadfast allies in the process. Very interesting because it gives you this perspective, because we did never think of ourselves as second-class citizens. In fact, we always thought we were equal, sometimes better, but that's not always how the world sees us. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Great to be back with you again.
Yeah, this is such a wonderful book. And, it's a tour de force. Like, this is not just the Second World War, but everything leading up, and how it's defined everything that has come later and the war itself. Like, this was quite a task. What were you thinking?
Well, thank you for that. I think my wife asked me the same question at one point. What were you thinking, Tim? As you noted, it's not my first book, and I knew
Yeah.
how the war ended. But on the other hand, this is a story I wanted to tell now. The book has just come out. Of course, there's this incendiary election to the south.
Yeah.
And I was, frankly, I wanted our friends there, and I mean that, our friends, our allies, to know that we were good allies during the Second World War. That's the title of the book.
Yeah.
And as you nicely say, it covers, an extensive period of politics, of security issues, of trade, economics, wartime industry. Of course, listeners will remember 1.1 million Canadians served in uniform. That's from a country of 11.5 million. So
Yeah.
we had 1 in 10 Canadians in uniform, another 3 million serving in wartime industry. So almost everyone was involved in this war. And yet, when I talk to my American friends, Senator, they often knew almost nothing about Canada's involvement.
They won the war. They were there. Yeah.
That's right. And fair enough.
Yeah.
Americans are very proud of their key role in World War II, as they call it. We call it the Second World War.
Yeah.
A small difference, but a reminder there that, of course, the Great War, the First World War, is so fundamental to Canada as well. And we've talked about that. So this is a book I wanted Americans to know about, but frankly, Canadians too, because we haven't done a good job in telling this history, in teaching it to young people. And this is a time where we can be proud. It was a desperate period. I don't want anyone to think I'm painting this as just a heroic tale.
No, absolutely.
45,000 Canadians were killed during the Second War. There are memorials across this country. And Senator, you and I have talked about that in your hometown and in other places, but it's an important story to tell.
No, it certainly is. And we have this, well, we always have a love-hate relationship with the Americans, right? And notice us, and then we tend to be arrogant in terms of our relationships with them. But it's really intriguing because this, the whole debate that got us in and them laterally in to this conflict from two countries that had chosen very different paths. I mean, we saw ourselves as the most important Commonwealth outpost, and our identification was obviously with Britain. And then stateside, those who broke away from the empire and charted an independent course as a republic. And it had kind of split us. And it took a prime minister here and a president there to kind of forge a relationship to bring the two back together. Just talk a little bit about Mackenzie, King, and FDR.
Yeah. Well, it's worth remembering, of course, when Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, starting the war in Europe. And we should remember the Japan had already invaded China, and that war was raging. But that brings Britain and France into the war. But everyone is looking to the United States. Surely the Great Republic, a key leader in Western democracies, will join this war effort. And of course, they do not. They remain neutral. And Canada, we're in a really difficult position here.
Yeah.
We want to stand by Britain, and we will decide in the House of Commons to go to war on the 10th of September,
Yeah.
Britain going to war on the 3rd of September. So that's a conscious decision. But it leaves us in a really difficult place because in North America, you have one country at war, Canada. United States, the Republic, deeply neutral, does not want to be drawn into this war, and that leaves us, in a terrible turmoil. And our Prime Minister of the day, as you mentioned, William Lyon Mackenzie King, not terribly charismatic, not generally seen as a great thruster of a leader. And Senator, you covered many prime ministers over the days, and Mackenzie King is not that, but he is a steady hand. He's our longest serving prime minister too, almost 22 years, if I remember correctly. So he's worth thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
And he's not the most likable of characters. I've read his diaries. I've read his papers. He was it has to be said, a sad, lonely man, deeply religious, as we know, with some other issues and others. But we shouldn't let that obscure his great political shrewdness. You don't become prime minister for 22 years by being a country bumpkin. And so one of the key things King realizes is he needs to bring the United States into the war. Britain and France desperate for American support. And that's a key role that Canada will play. And we do it very well, especially in 1940 when America is neutral, and then the fall of France and Britain, which is a cataclysmic event in June of 1940. Britain retreats, the British Army, whatever's left of it, retreats back to Britain. And this is where Canada begins to play a key role. And so I explore that in the book of Canada sending its best diplomats down to Washington, a king going on multiple trips to try to get the Americans to send weapons and supplies to Britain, but to also assist Canada. And he makes it very clear, and Roosevelt agrees with this, that the Americans need a strong Canada on its northern border. The cataclysmic event for the United States would be if Canada was invaded by Nazi Germany and conquered, and there you have Nazi Germany on your border. And so,
sorry, Tim, to interrupt, but honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about that. And your book really captured that the threat of U-boats, German U-boats off the east coast of Canada, that was real. And so it did really start to define how important the Americans understood our status to be.
Yes, it was our strength, our military strength.
Yeah.
And there is some resonance with today that we might talk about. But certainly we helped the Americans on the East Coast before the war. And then listeners will remember when Japan attacks in December of 41, Pearl Harbor, of course, 2 Canadian battalions in Hong Kong, which are overrun. But that's also when we step up. We help the Americans, our Royal Canadian Navy, which has been in the war for almost 2 years. It's battle tested. It is now has 100 warships. It will eventually go to over 400, the 4th largest navy in the world. We help the Americans on the East Coast. We help them on the West Coast. We send 4 RCAF squadrons to Alaska because Alaska is deeply threatened by the Japanese thrust. And over again, Canada stands up and stands beside our allies, even when we're worried about sovereignty issues. And there's always a tension there between leaning into the US so that we can help Britain, but how far do we lean? And of course, pretty much, as you said from the top, almost every Canadian government has struggled with that one way or the other. But the foundation of that is really the Second World War.
And it's, it does have parallels today when you find the debate still very live in the US about whether or not they should be involved in foreign wars. and who is the proponent of that. And then the other thing, and I want you to comment on both these things. The other thing is when you talk about the power of our military, and we were going here and we were going to Alaska and we were on the coast, and the Americans were signing up to fly with our guys because they weren't, they had no outlet to do that. And where we are today with the state of our military, it's troubling.
It is. It's, one of the things I was looking at. Of course, I'm a historian. I'm firmly
Right.
in the past, but there are echoes to the present. And as I was researching and writing this book, Senator, I kept thinking about the world in which we live in, this world of wars and great uncertainty, of debates in the U.S., as you
Yeah.
said, of should they be involved in alliances? Is NATO worthwhile? And I want to come back to that. But
Yeah.
yes, one of the reasons why we were impactful during the Second World War is because we had that strong military, that 1.1 million Canadians
Yeah.
fighting around the world, on the oceans, in the air, in multiple land campaigns, in Italy and in Northwest Europe, liberating the oppressed. And we can talk more about that.
And with equipment.
With all of the equipment made in Canada, an industrial power.
Yeah.
And as I write in the book, we couldn't have done it without the Americans. We needed American financial support to buy our war supplies and war weapons. But we were interconnected there. And
Yes.
the border almost disappears by 1942. I talk about this in the book because there's so much trade back and forth. And what do we produce in the war? 16,000 aircraft, thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of machine guns and Lee Enfield rifles, hundreds of millions of artillery shells. Maybe our greatest contribution, 850,000 trucks that are being used by the British Army, the Americans, even the Soviets when they come into the war on our side after Nazi Germany invades. We were an industrial power. And the argument I make in the book, one of the arguments, is that we often think of those fighting forces abroad, but we had to secure North America.
Yeah.
You can't send armies overseas if North America is threatened. And that was an essential process of which Canadian diplomats and soldiers working with the Americans find ways to overcome national differences. And initially, the fact that the Americans are neutral, we're at war, and we create a very strong and secure North America. And then we can begin to fight abroad, and how necessary that was in this war of just utter barbarity where we had to win. And Canadians understood that at the time. And I think we still know that.
It was so brutal. Just stop for a minute and tell us. I mean, generally, of course, America, just as we've discussed, was kind of wary of another foreign war and getting into, what the implications would be. But it is surprising that they sat back. Why? What was really at the core of that?
Yeah, there's a very strong lobby in the U.S. in September of 39 and before that. That does not want to fight another European war. They had looked at the First World War. You'll remember, of course, they came in late to that
Yep,
war in April of
exactly.
1917. And I remember reading an interview with a Canadian veteran of the First World War. And he said something to the effect of, when we compare ourselves to the United States, they're richer, they're more prosperous. There isn't always a lot when we compare ourselves. Now, he was saying this, I think, in the 50s. There isn't a
Hmm.
lot always to see ourselves as superior. But in the First World War, we were fighting from the start on the side of justice, on the side of history. And the same could be said for the Second World War. We
Absolutely.
understood we had to fight at Britain's side, yes, but we had Canadian national interests as well. And we sacrificed our own security over and over again in that war to ensure that Britain could survive.
Yeah.
We allowed those U-boats, like we weakened our Navy. The U-boats came down the St. Lawrence in the summer of 1942. We assist the Americans in the U-boat war on the East Coast. We support the landings in North Africa. All of this, we take the hit so our allies can stay in the war or be more productive. To come back to your initial question, the US is not seeing the war through that lens. In September of 39, President Roosevelt understands that Americans are not into there are public opinion polls that say that only 5% of Americans want to go to war. So it's overwhelming. And it takes Roosevelt, and I write about this in the book, he needs to push and prod and prepare the military. The Americans had starved their military, as we did during the Depression, as some might say we have done today. They were only the 19th largest army in the world in 1939. So there was actually a reason not to go to war, because they were deeply
unprepared. They weren't ready. They
weren't ready. Yeah. So it takes a while, but Canada does play a role in helping to bring the United States into that war, supporting Britain with finance and war supplies, and understanding the crisis that emerges.
Roosevelt was, as we've said, sort of the spokesperson for speak softly and carry a big stick. But to your point, they weren't really carrying the big stick right at that moment. So it was a little bit more bluster, but eventually he figures it out, and comes to Kingston and gives a speech and says, we will not stand idly by if Canada is threatened by another empire. So then what was happening? What caused that?
Yeah, that speech is interesting. It's a little before the war, so it's August of 38, and Canadians look at that and say, okay, that's great. It actually forces Mackenzie King and the Liberal cabinet to begin to rearm more seriously, because it can be seen on one hand as the president coming to Kingston and at Queen's saying, we will not let anyone invade your country. We'll stand by you. It was also viewed by some saying, well, look at our pathetic military. And what will happen is that the US will, in effect, have to invade Canada if we are ever under occupation. So we better build up our defenses. And Mackenzie King is able to make that argument to his cabinet. And so that helps to propel us forward. But the fact that the U.S. remains neutral in September of 30, that's the great shock, because
this is what's kind of puzzling about this period. So they were doing their, we have the big stick and we will come and defend you, but then they didn't. And we had the obvious response, which is, okay, we got to defend ourselves, not only to help Britain, but because it's always, as you said earlier, this sovereignty question. And if they come across here to fight their war through us or to, deal with the North, then we're going to be in trouble. So what was he like? Why was he making that speech at that time?
He said it was the obvious statement. When people questioned him and said, isn't that remarkable you said that? He said, well, it's obvious. We would never let anyone occupy Canada. What was less obvious, I think, was how they would do it and how they would push us. And I think, as you know, Senator, you covered more stories than I have out of Washington. There's always a push and a prod there. And clearly they want to see Canada strengthen security and defenses. But when they don't stand up really for Western democracies at the start of the war, everyone is shaken. And then we're forced to really grow up very quickly. And that means crash building our Navy, our Army, and our Air Force, of which we send our best forces to Britain so that Britain's not knocked out of the war in the summer of 1940. But we are always working with the Americans and things like the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, which is still with us today, helped us solve some of these issues. The Americans are very keen to build a highway to the north, the Alaska Highway, which is just one of the many legacies of the war. Canada's not too sure about this. On a map, it looks like the Americans are building a road that's going to split Canada in two and unite with Alaska, which is a great fear from the 19th century onwards. But we do it because we understand the Americans this is after Pearl Harbor, so they're in a frenzy, they're in a desperation. We allow that to happen, but at the end of the war, we pay for that road and we take it over, along with all the other elements. There are new airports and airways built across this country, partially to train up those 131,000 airmen you mentioned, thousands of which are Americans, to fight overseas. This is just part of our story, which is really quite astonishing. And again, Americans just don't know anything about this. Although you could probably say a lot of Canadians, this would be
Yeah, I
new
don't
to them.
either. And we do kind of get lost in the story beside even given the incredible numbers and the efforts, because once they go in, we become kind of the bit player
Yeah,
again. And
yeah.
I know that rankles a lot still today.
Yeah, it's difficult when Churchill and Roosevelt begin to cement their friendship
Right.
and alliance after December 41. Canada does get squeezed out, and Mackenzie King recognizes that. Where we still matter, though, is in the defense of North America because the Americans can't do it without us.
Right.
And to varying degrees of success, we aren't always successful. Sometimes the Americans simply just take us for granted. We have to fight. We have to give you elbows up. We send some of our best soldiers and diplomats, including Lester B. Pearson, future
Right.
Prime Minister of Canada, to
Yep.
Washington as our ambassador. And what a treat it was, Senator, to read his diary of that time
Yes.
period.
Of the
And
time.
the inside scoop on how Washington works, as it still works today, with parties and perhaps a few cold drinks lubricating the throat as you hear and share ideas. But he was there. We had a great general, Lieutenant General Maurice Pope, who was a bilingual Canadian, a Great War veteran. He impressed the Americans and the British. All the while, we are trying to be helpful, trying to amplify the alliance, and not being taken for granted. And that's a
Yep.
delicate dance. And of course, it's one that happens today. We always need to ensure that we are remembered and recognized in Washington, where there are so many other players. And as I found in the book,
Yeah.
and which I think resonates today, is that it takes a lot of work to make a successful alliance work and to be achievable. And I think the Americans spend a lot of time, we know, looking south on that
Yep.
border, and they look
Sure.
east and they look west, and they don't pay a lot of attention to the north. I read a lot of books in this on American alliance systems and the
Yep.
debates around that. It's so strange that Canada's almost never mentioned.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're just there.
No, I remember, and Ronald Reagan said it when he was, here on the plains of Abraham for the summit and whatnot, and just sort of saying it's like, you're the cousins that live upstairs. They mean it really kindly and with a warm embrace, and we go, what?
Yeah.
What do you mean we're just living upstairs? It's always the tension that's there, and you would have uncovered a lot of that through the reading. It must have been fascinating.
It was. And one thing that emerged both in the historical study and then thinking about today is that the US really needed us
Yeah,
during the war. They needed us for our war supplies, they needed us for our minerals. I'd written a lot of books, but I hadn't thought about this. All of that aluminum, which we pull 3 billion tons out of the earth, and most of it goes to the US to build all the aircraft.
right,
Nickel, we are still a
right.
nickel superpower. It goes south. Incredible hydroelectricity. We're powering northern US. This all gets forgotten today, but it's
Yeah,
part of why the US really, and the US, you have to say this, gives us a lot of good deals during the war, sends a
right.
lot of trade our way, because they understand that this alliance system with Canada, it's absolutely crucial to the shield of North America, the frontier of defense. It's always better to have a happy, strong ally on your
Yeah.
border than a weak, angry one.
Well,
And
look, we talk about it every day with the Russians' incursions almost daily into our airspace. I mean,
yeah,
the issue has not changed.
it hasn't changed, and there are definitely some lessons I think in this. One, is just the incredible exertion of Canada. My American friends, even my British friends, sometimes I'll talk to them, and they're almost scratching their head, like I'm putting them on that we had 1 million Canadians in
Right.
uniform, the fourth largest Navy, that we were involved in the air war in everywhere, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Northwest Europe, that our army is fighting In Italy, 100,000 Canadians, including, as I recount in the book, 1st Special Service Force, that unique unit of Canadians and Americans in the same unit who fight together. Incredibly tough fighting force, delivering victory after victory. And sometimes one way just to think about this, of how we are there, is to think about some of the key amphibious operations and invasions. Think of the invasion of Sicily, July of 1943. 3 American divisions on the left, 3 British on the right, 1 Canadian in the center, if you look at it. We are there. We are fighting. We are there for the invasion of the Italian mainland in September of 1943. Americans, British, Canadians. And then, of course, D-Day, as we have talked, Senator, the 6th of June, 1944. 2 British divisions, 2 American with a 3rd reinforcing, and Canada on Juno Beach. We are there. We are a junior member of this important alliance, but we are there because of our martial might and our home front industrial influence. And this is something that we should talk about and be proud to talk about and to teach and to share these stories because it matters.
Well, and as you describe it in the book, I mean, we did have our own military, our industrial military complex. I mean, this was a huge set of industries, manufacturing and all of that, which of course we can bemoan the fact we've let that go, but that was really powerful. I mean, there were the 1,000,000+ soldiers, but it was also that base there. And we did this at a time when Canada had been gutted by the Depression. And as you suggest in the book, thousands of people were fleeing Canada for the US at that time, for opportunity, for jobs, for all sorts of things. And we still managed to hold it together with just 11 million people.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing that industrial home front, some 3 million workers, hundreds of thousands of women who entered the workforce, who play a really critical role. Just factories that are pumping out machine guns and helmets and uniforms and artillery pieces and Hurricane fighters and Lancaster bombers and hundreds of millions. It's really astonishing, and I recount this in the book. And Senator, I've been doing this for a while, but it's always interesting when you do a bit of a deep dive into a topic and you begin to see things through a new light. And often our history books are, when we write about the war, it's often overseas and it's our fighting forces there. And I've written those books, and this book has some of that fighting as well. But to think about the critical role of North America and its legacies is really interesting. And you talked about one there, the industrialization of Canada. Yeah. We were a very poor country in the Depression years. You might even say a pathetic country and really floundering. And it takes the war to pull us out of that slough of despond. And then we move forward. And the second half of the 20th century, we are a prosperous, wealthy, outward-looking nation. Think of the first half. Think of the South African War, the First World War, the Depression years, and the Second World War. My goodness, think about our grandparents or great-grandparents and what they passed through. And it's the Second World War that really fundamentally changes us as a country. The emergence of the social security net. Yeah. It comes during the Second World War. And largely, the argument is this very strong state control over the war effort. To win the war, we should do this now to win the peace. We should help Canadians move forward out of poverty and depression. Now, you can make the argument 30, 35, 40 years later, it was not sustainable, it needed to change, whatever that is. But that social security net is there. The way Canadians looked outward, we joined NATO as a founding member in 1949. That seems unthinkable before the Second World War. Yeah. We have a powerful force of diplomats around the world. We have a very strong army that will then fight in Korea in 1950 and be involved in peacekeeping throughout much of the Cold War. There's more to it, but those legacies, including how we will continue to work with the United States to defend North America, it's important to untangle and to understand where we came from because it certainly influences us today.
Well, it was a genuine coming of age because I mean, it's not that the Americans are were at the time even, callous to the concept of freedom. I mean, that's part of their defining nature, and they eventually did come in. But as you detail it just there, coming from the hell that the country had come through, and it's our defining and our one of our proudest moments in terms of what we became as a result of the war effort, but also our willingness to respond to the fascism, to the totalitarianism, to the communism that was gripping Italy and then Germany. I mean, when you think about it, Hitler could have conquered an entire continent. And everybody was thinking that when he started to invade in Denmark and Norway and all of that at the beginning. Um, I mean, that was you had a comment here from Mackenzie King who wrote, "It is what we do, it is what we prevent rather than what we do that counts most in government," and that seemed to be our motivation, his mantra, but our motivation. Is that fair?
Yeah, Mackenzie King, that was certainly one of his mantras, and it's not always been the most heroic of statements.
Right.
Um, right? Because Mackenzie King was a waffler and he liked to lead from the
Yep.
rear. Although
Yep.
in my book, he comes out better when dealing with the United States,
Yeah.
certainly. But certainly, this idea that Canada goes to war, understands why it's going to war, and that it really is a war for democracy, Western liberal idealism. It's not the democracy we have today. Things have
Right.
changed, of course, but it really is. The difference is, as you said, it's fascism, it's Nazism, it's totalitarianism. And we know what it was like to live under those regimes. Everybody suffers horrendously. And of course, there is the Holocaust
Yeah.
against Jewish people. So, this is a war that had to be won, and we understood that the alliance system that is forged during the course of the war and that comes out of it is one that really shapes much of the world that we still live in today. And the effects of the Second World War, we still see them in places like the Middle East or
Yep.
Ukraine and Russia, or many of those other hot spots around the world. It's one of the reasons why it continues to fascinate me, Senator, why I
Mhm.
continue to explore it. Um, in my books, I am always interested in those ordinary men and women who serve in uniform. I read their letters and diaries. I've spoken to them. I've interviewed them. They're an important part of this story. I was surprised to find 30,000 Americans who served in the Canadian Armed Forces. I was down in Arlington at the National Cemetery. There's a cross of sacrifice there put up to the tens of thousands of Americans serving in Canadian forces in the First World War and the Second War in Korea who have died. And to me, maybe that more than anything else is the symbol that Canadians and Americans today should think about that cross of sacrifice there. Those Americans who served with Canadians shoulder to shoulder, who lost their lives, just as Canadians have served in the American armed
Yeah.
forces. And we are connected by service and sacrifice, by connected by kin and by blood. We have our differences,
Right.
and I talk about
Yeah.
that in the book. And we have our worries, but we are in it together.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, as and you have spoken and taken the oral history of those who served, and we don't have many left now from World War II. All the more reason for the importance of this book to capture because there's no kingpin on the battlefield, right? You have each other's backs, regardless of, what flag you fly under at home. And so that is important to remember that it's people to people, and it's true today. There's there's been a kerfuffle on the internet, I guess, recently about about the history of this period of time and about Churchill. I don't want to get into it, but Holocaust denial and all of that. What is your perspective as a historian on Churchill, who came into power when all seemed but lost?
He is the most important person in the 20th century. Full stop.
Wow.
He is he through his sheer force and will and doggedness keeps Britain in the war in that dark, dark period where they could have gone under. And if they had, not only would tens of thousands of Canadians who were serving there have been probably put to the sword eventually,
Yeah.
but who knows what kind of world we would live in. It's just that simple. Churchill, had opinions of a late 19th century British imperialist, without a doubt. You may not have wanted to invite him to your dinner table, although he was an incredible companion and could talk your ear off for hours, and you would be talking to him on this show for another 6 hours.
Yeah.
But
if you didn't mind the cigar smoke, that's
exactly. He's Titanic, and he features in my book.
Yeah.
And there will always be people who want to question one element of him or another. It's just like Sir John A. Macdonald, who is the most important Canadian, who had 19th century views, and we apply 21st century human rights
standards. I know.
him.
You and I've talked about this before. It drives us both crazy. That was then. This is now.
Yeah, and understand in the context of the time, but surely the world is a better place with the Allies having won in 1945 than if it had been a draw, which it could very well have been, with Hitler in control of Western Europe.
Yeah. So the downfall of France and because Britain was surely the next domino to fall, that's the moment when the US knew it could not survive as a lone island, and that was the argument we could then make to them.
That becomes part of it, yes. I think it's tremendous shock in the United States, as it is around the world.
Yeah.
It's, when France collapses and Britain retreats back to the island, and everyone realizes we have to start sending supplies.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, Roosevelt, when Churchill pleads with him to send fighter aircraft, he says, no, I can't. Partially because he needed to build up North American defenses, because now it looked like the war might come across the Atlantic, as it would eventually through U-boats. But it's Canada. We send all of our best forces to Britain, our destroyers, our squadrons, another division with others to follow. And we do that, again, to come back to what I mentioned earlier, we sacrifice our own security. We could have cowered in North America. We didn't. We wouldn't let Britain go under. And that's an important story to remember, that Canada and Canadians understood that they had to keep Britain in this war. The argument I make is that to do that fully, to allow our full economic, industrial, and military might, we needed to lean into the US. And that's the delicate maneuvering that those Canadians faced. And I sometimes thought, as I was writing this over the last couple of years and researching, Canadians today still have that same delicate relationship with Washington or London. Yep. How far are you willing to bend your principles and still keep your autonomy? What will we do in defense spending is a good example of the one that's flared up most fiercely. Clearly, it's no longer possible to keep it at the 1.37 or what that figure is.
We have to step up again. Yeah.
That's right. So, those are complex, tough questions. I was lucky to be in the audience when the Secretary General of NATO came to Ottawa, Jens Stoltenberg, and he said, I was a former prime minister. I understand it's tough to put money towards defense when you have to pay for schools and health and everything. Yeah. But as he said, the world is a very dangerous place. Yeah. And he didn't quite say this, but others have. Well, you'll pay more later if
Yeah.
we don't pay now.
That
And
that was implicit in his. So, just talk for a moment as we move to wrap this up about the Augsburg Agreement, because that seemed to be our moment of equality, or when we achieved it. Why don't we just
yeah,
talk?
that's in August of 1940, and King has gone down to meet President Roosevelt, and the two of them get along uh, fine, and they get along really well. And it surprises some people because
Yeah,
Roosevelt is so outgoing and loquacious and charismatic, and King is something quite different. And
right.
yet they found ways to connect. And it's what we would call summit diplomacy. And King gets a really good deal for Canada. It's a good security deal. In effect, it says that through the permanent joint board on defense, we will work together as equals to defend North America. And it's still with us today.
Yeah,
Now, there are all kinds of other mechanisms and boards in place, trade, economic, business, military, but that's still there. And so is that thinking, I suspect, even though the Americans, as a superpower, have all kinds of other things they need to worry about. They always should remember that the North is secure,
yeah,
that the border is secure, that we were throughout most of the 20th century the number one trading partner of the United States. And to come back to the title of the book, we were good allies, we remain good allies, and in the future we will always be good allies. That
yeah.
doesn't mean that we won't
Have
complain
our
and push back.
differences. We won't have our little battles. It's
That's
true,
right.
and they're important. Uh, it's odd. And because I think you mentioned this in the book, and I remember talking about this on an earlier incarnation of a television program I did, talking with Wayne and Schuster about what they did for the troops. Because again, we tend to think of Bob Hope and how the country responds, even though it was such a belated response. But we had that side to us too. It wasn't just those other issues. We were just all in.
The cultural side, I write about that. Both the CBC and the NFB emerge as foundational institutions during the Second War, reporting on the war, sharing that news with Canadians, creating films
Yeah,
or radio broadcasts. It's really astonishing. And as part of that, a stronger sense of Canadian identity emerges from
yeah,
the war. It's forged in the fire. And some of that is that age old trope or idea that we're not British, we're not American, we are Canadian. And that is what this war does for us on many fronts. But maybe one of the most important one is, as you've said, it helps to crystallize who we are as a
yeah.
North American people
Define us. Yeah,
and define us.
yeah.
Yes.
The Good Allies, how Canada and the United States fought together to defeat fascism during the Second World War. I've got to say, I've read many of your books, and I think the writing in this is intense and beautiful, and you've managed to just capture so many aspects. We've only just touched on it, so I really want to encourage, particularly at this time, as you say, in our shared history, for people to go and read this. So find The Good Allies by Tim Cook. And you know what? We're going to come back to you in Remembrance Month next month, and talk to you about the Korean War, because you've written another book called Canada and the Korean War: Histories and Legacies of a Cold War Conflict, because this was often considered a lesser war, almost a forgotten war, but it was also a key war, and remains so today.
It does, and it's that one is with a colleague at the War Museum, Andrew Birch, and a number of great scholars. And we really wanted to, as you said, that's a forgotten war. Those veterans, we had 30,000 Canadians who served in
Yeah,
Korea. They're almost all gone. Almost all
yeah,
the Second World War generation are gone. We think now fewer than 10,000 from 1.1 million. And I
wow,
wonder, Senator, we're on that razor's edge, as I have said, where we will, over the next 5, 6, 7 years, probably lose almost all of them.
yeah,
And then it's up to the rest of us to keep telling their stories and to reflect on their incredible service and sacrifice, both as lesson and warning, as a guide forward, and perhaps to better know who we are as Canadians.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, because you keep the story real and alive and contemporary, because it does matter. It still matters every single day. How and what we did then, shapes us. Tim Cook, leading military historian, director of research at the Canadian War Museum, the author of 19 books. And honestly, I had some friends go through the War Museum this summer. They were visiting from Alberta. And I've just got to say, you sometimes forget how powerful that place is. And that if we could get every young Canadian through that door, it would really help us all keep those stories alive. So thank you for your work there, and for just continuing to capture the stories in these books that you write. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you so much.
Great. Tim Cook. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Thanks.